And welcome back to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host. Remember to hit subscribe. And today on Unplanned, we're going to talk about movies, which is a great subject, movies and cities. And we're for our guest today, we have Tom Meek, who writes and has written for many publications about film, including Cambridge Day, which is our local newspaper, but he's also been at WBUR and other places, and you can tell us all about
Boston, Phoenix, contributed at the Globe a couple of articles there. I've written for a lot of alternative weeklies around the country. However, many of them have folded, just like the Boston Phoenix has. The alternative weekly is kind of a dinosaur these days, sadly to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, welcome to Unplanned.
Thank you.
It's a thrill to have you here. So Tom, I gave you I asked you if you'd be on Unplanned, and you graciously said you would. And I said, well, pick a movie, and it has to have some connection to cities. And what movie did you pick?
Well, I always believe in trying to pick something that's kind of current because everybody's mind's about it. So The Batman, not Batman, The Batman, the latest reboot to the Batman franchise, I guess.
And my task was I had to go see the movie. And I think it's a fair statement to say, first time I've been in a theater in over 2 years, easily. Quite an experience, actually. Wonderful to be back.
Yeah, which theater did you see it at?
Well, interestingly enough, we have a mutual friend named Craig Kelly.
Oh, yes.
Craig pinged me and he said he was going to see To Be or Not to Be with Ernst Lubitsch at the Coolidge Corner Theater. And I said, I'll meet you there. Of course, I was running late. I got there, it was totally sold out. Craig was already in the theater. So I thought, well, I'm an hour early for Batman. I'm going to head back up to the Somerville Theater and watch it there. So I raced up to the Somerville Theater, caught the 8 o'clock show there.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, it's during the whole pandemic, I think I had seen maybe about a dozen movies in the movie theater, including press screenings, because they had actually even stepped away from doing press screenings, and it sort of became more of a thing that we now watch. We'll watch big screen extravaganzas on our small box. So movies like The Black Widow, we would see. Actually, I'd watch it on my iPad, which seems weird to do when you're reviewing a film, but also too when we pick best films at the end of the year, they give us DVDs or links, so you're constantly looking at the small screen now, and the small screen has now become a very viable thing with COVID. You know, a lot of things are now being streamed. I mean, we have Netflix, we have Amazon Prime, so they're making Prime videos that either show up in the theater and on their streaming platform, or they come out in a movie theater and then stream. There are a couple of movies like the latest James Bond and The Batman where they're only about showing it and screening it on the big screen, and then you going to see it only on the big screen.
Yeah, I mean, that actually, just those comments make me think of so much, including a friend of mine who said many years ago now, really, it actually can be a great joy to sit down with your laptop and headphones and you get completely into the movie. You'd think you might not, but you actually do. You really get drawn in.
Yeah, with any movie, I mean, especially if you're going to watch a film that's a serious drama or a foreign language film where you actually have to read the subtitles, it's very hard to multitask and actually give the art form its due. And that's one of the great things about going to a movie theater, because put your phone away, don't text and all that stuff. And unless you take a bathroom break, you're 100% engaged with the movie, unless you fall asleep during it, and then that's either a testament to the quality of the film or your state of mind walking into the film.
And while we're just on the subjects of theaters and non-theaters, let's just spend a second on the Coolidge Corner Theater and the Somerville Theater and the Brattle Theater, and just these great local theaters, these wonderful things that must go back, I don't know, at least 100 years, I would guess at this point. I don't know.
The Somerville Theater, I believe, is exactly 100 years old. I don't know if it's been exhibiting film for that whole time. I forget exactly what the date is on the Coolidge Corner Theater, but I think it might be less than 100, but it's definitely more than 75 as far as being a screen exhibiting place. It almost shut down in the late 80s, early 90s. I don't know if you remember that.
No, I forgot.
David Kleiler saved it. Rest his soul. He passed away about 2 years ago. He saved it and then almost ran it back into the ground again. And then that's under the Beacon Cinema Group has really blossomed. They just got a huge grant. They're going to build out another 2 theaters and some common space there. It's really, really amazing what they're doing there. And the Somerville Theater, too, has undergone a bit of a transformation. Sadly, they lost 2 movie theaters, but they added a performance room, the Crystal Ballroom, which was actually, when they first built that theater space, was actually there was a Crystal Ballroom there. So that's why it's renamed that after it. So
yeah, it's fascinating. And that whole, I mean, that could be a whole other topic about the relationship we now have with public spaces post-COVID. I mean, and the advent of all this electronica that we're constantly on all the time. Another factoid about the Somerville Theater, and we all have to fact check this one. I believe Franklin Roosevelt's secretary grew up above the Somerville Theater. I think her name was Missy LeHand. Check all facts on this. But I believe she grew up right in Davis Square and eventually went to work for Franklin, and he went on to the White House. And
a factoid I did not know.
We'll have to check that. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground already, but let's dig right into the movie that you chose, which is The Batman. Quite a film. I did go see it. I enjoyed it tremendously. Help us set the stage. What is the movie? What's it about?
I mean, it's the DC comic franchise, right? I mean, it's gone through history with many. I mean, of course, the DC comic, and of course, we know the 1960s sort of hyperbolic, definitely comical slapstick version with Adam West, and then long since then it was dormant. And honestly, besides the Superman franchise with Christopher Reeve, it was kind of the beginning of the super. You wouldn't call it part of what we're seeing now with the Marvel and the DC comic stuff, but it really was the predecessor to all that as far as a big box office extravaganza, the one with Michael Keaton, directed by Tim Burton in 1990 with Jack Nicholson as the Joker. So we had that franchise in it. Burton directed 1 or 2 versions of it there, and then it switched over to Joel Schumacher, and we had Val Kilmer and George Clooney as Batman. So I consider that Batman version 2.0. Then we had the Christopher Nolan, the Dark Knight series with Christian Bale and 3 films in that, and Thomas Hardy as Bane. And it got really dark in that variation of the film where it was more about Christian Bale's character being sort of a tormented soul and acting out vengeance and looking for revenge because his parents were killed by the Joker. Do I dance by the light of the moon? Very famous kind of catchphrase in all these series, and much darker than the Tim Burton ones, even though they were definitely dark, but they were comically dark. And then we have an even darker reboot with Matt Reeves and Robert Pattinson in the Batman role, even darker than the Christian Bale one. And I think it's almost a little too dark in the sense that the one thing that was nice about the Tim Burton Batmans and the Christopher Nolan Batmans was the persona of Batman was bifurcated, right? I mean, when he was Bruce Wayne, the rich guy, you could definitely see a little trouble behind his eyes, but he had a personality. Here, it feels like he's a tortured soul no matter what mask he's wearing. And it just sort of, I feel like it tells us this is a deeply emotional story, but yet I don't feel that there's a lot to the soul of the character.
Well, it's interesting. So let's jump back just.
But it's a great film. I mean, as far as action and setting and
the Batman. Yeah. But let's jump back a little bit because probably like you, I'm gonna guess. I grew up with the Batman TV show. It was on every day after school, and you'd watch whatever it was, a half hour of Batman. A kind of ridiculously camp show, but great watching at the same time, and all the characters were. Then fast forward to, I think you said 1990 and the first Batman movie, and it is a question that I've had. this creation of these comic book characters into these huge franchises, basically. We're going to get back to the movie, but can you talk a little bit about that? I find that a very interesting sort of factoid about, maybe it's a comment about the film industry more broadly, just, we know we've got a good character here, let's build a franchise around it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think there was an article I read somewhere that, comic book reading was dropping off at some point in time, even after that Batman series. And somehow it just sort of, it kept going. There was a culture to it. I think somebody wrote about how it was DC or Marvel almost went bankrupt, and then somebody revived it. And part of the plan was to turn it into film franchises. And of course, it worked out quite well. And once, the first one came out, I think the first Marvel film was either a Captain America or an Iron Man movie. And, they put a huge budget behind it, so they gambled on it. Once that was successful, with teasers to the next film, or you get a glimmer of, Hawkeye or, Scarlett Johansson's character in one of these other one-offs, and then they'd get their own franchise. So you have a ready-made audience. You can spend $200 million on that production of that film and know you're going to make it back. It's like a James Bond movie.
Right.
In other words, so, I don't know
but going back to it, if you think about the comic book character and then the 1960s TV show, there's not, my own view, there's not a lot there to the character himself. Batman is not a very complex person by any definition. And yet you're building these long stories about it. We will get to the Batman and we will actually talk about the film, but that was a thought I had. There's a sort of epic quality to the Batman, and yet the underlying character, if you go back to the earliest comic books, is a sort of a crime fighter, right? The crime fighter in Gotham City.
Well, I think I'm not a big comic book reader. I should state that up front, and I think a lot of comic book readers would probably say that the comic books are a lot deeper than that TV series was.
Sure.
As a matter of fact, there was a TV series that actually was kind of fun in a strange way, The Peacemaker, okay. Which came out of also a DC comic, which came out of the Suicide Squad, a movie that they showed it on a small screen. It was actually pretty wittily done. It was done by the guy, James Gunn, who did the Guardians of the Galaxies film. So it was funny, but also very dark. And reading about it, after I was like, oh, that was surprisingly good. I went back and I started reading about the characters. Each one of those characters that looks like a throwaway creation for the film actually has like a huge psychological profile, their own cartoon comic book. It's pretty, and the Batman, the Dark Knight series, the comic books, I guess, have a lot of material in that. And a lot of these filmmakers, when they come to it, try to actually stay loyal to that. I think one of the things is they don't want to disenfranchise the fans of that series, and they want to bring it to the screen with some genuosity.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into the Batman.
The Batman, sure thing.
Yeah. So where were you going? So it has now. Correct me on the name. Robert Pattinson.
Robert Pattinson, right?
And what's his background? What's his story? And this is the first Batman he's being the Batman.
This is the first one he's doing, and it's in the Robert Pattinson. Obviously, he became famous for the Twilight Saga.
Right. Right.
He was the handsome vampire,
right.
Opposite Kristen Stewart's mortal love interest. I don't know. I'm not certain I watched it's kind of a occupational hazard, I guess. I'm not certain I watched the entire series. Or if I did, they all felt like the same thing over and over again. I don't think I actually ever had to write about any of those, but I did go to some of the press screenings. It's one of those things I guess I would dig more into if I was writing about them.
But let's get us back to the Batman, because it's occurring to me that UnPlanned is a show about cities and how they work. So we have to also wrap in the whole urban side. So he's in there, and who else is starring in this?
Zoe Kravitz is the Catwoman,
right.
and his love interest.
Right.
She's never called the Catwoman. Her name's Selena. Jeffrey Wright, pretty decent character actor, last seen in The French Dispatch, is Commissioner Gordon.
Right.
And Peter Skarsgård plays the slimy DA. So getting to the city, everybody in this municipality of Gotham.
Right. Because as for all you Batman fans, it all happens in Gotham City, as we know. Yeah.
Which is, an amalgam for New York and every big cosmopolitan.
Sure.
The rendering of Gotham in this, that's kind of
very powerful. I'm just going to jump in and say the visuals are really stupendously good, I think. And there are so many essences of New York, but you also see bits of Chicago and other sort of aspects of urbanity. But it's a very convincing city. I assume most of that, if not all of it, was either sets or computer graphics, but it really, really amazing.
I think a combination of all the above. These days what they do to sort of create a set or something like that is really amazing. And it becomes, in some sense, to be authentic, have a degree of authenticity becomes harder and harder because now you got to go build your replica cars. You don't have them from the museums. You don't have those old planes. Things are less and less available. But the representation of Gotham throughout the series is, even if you go back to the 1960s, Gotham looks sort of like a shanty wharf town, if you recall, and in the Tim Burton visions, it's very sort of, you've seen his other films like Edward Scissorhands, and he was a producer of The Nightmare Before Christmas. He has this sort of dark cartoonish sort of look to his sets, and that Batman had that kind of look to it, whereas Nolan's Batman was a very dark, dense city look, just like a little bit like his Inceptions when he had his cityscapes. And then this one is even darker, and it has a bit of that dirtiness to the streets and a lot of rain slicking to it, and it's also very, very crowded. The other cities felt a little bit more spare, where this is a very, very populous city.
So let's just spend a second on that, just broadly what you were just talking about, which is that these filmmakers, these auteurs, as you called them, I think, they have a vision, they have there's something in their brain that this is the city, at least this is the city I'm going to depict in this film. This action is going to happen in this kind of a place. And then they created, and there's a whole thing in urban planning about the imaginary city. And there are lots of visions of cities of the future, including a lot of work done in the early 20th century, trying to imagine what that 20th century end of the city. And it's fascinating to think about how that sort of thinking can get represented really quite literally in a film. That is basically what filmmakers do, is they create worlds and then populate them with people and action and sort of drama and suspense. And very interesting idea. What happens in this movie? What is the Batman about, or what's going on in the film?
The villain du jour is the Riddler, who, as we know from previous incarnations, is sort of one of these jokey dad, sort of Wile E. Coyote. The bomb blows up on him, but not so much here. He's a very deaf killer out to take out a series of high-ranking officials in Gotham because he's got his own agenda against Gotham, which is corruption, and we can come back and talk about.
Well, let's jump right into that.
Because
when I said, what movie do you want to talk about? You said The Batman, and I said, well, that's interesting. Is that why is that movie so interesting to you? And you said, well, there's this whole corruption angle to it, and I'm curious. It does obviously plays a central role in the film, but what were you thinking? Why'd you choose it?
Well, a few things. You mentioned Chicago. Chicago's sort of notorious for having corruption. I think even some of the structures there look sort of very Daley-esque. The mayor's house sort of reminded me of Chicago as well. Also, too, I grew up in Connecticut, and I think it was like about every year it was either Waterbury or Bridgeport had a major scandal, corruption scandal with the mayor. I mean, we have Buddy Cianci down in Providence, and Providence is another town where it's, corruption is widely a thing that just is there. I don't know in New York City if it's that big of a thing there, but these are all small cities with the exception of Chicago, and it's just funny to see it pervasively in this Gotham. And the other thing about it, I mean, it's portrayed as a cancer, and weirdly enough, they do a great job of rooting it back to Batman and his parents also too, and how, this whole thing is very cyclical and it keeps giving itself, because at the heart of the matter is a giant trust fund to benefit basically those that have not, which becomes an enablement for a drug empire and all this corruption from the people on top who then want to keep all these dirty deeds locked down. It's just, it's a beehive, and into it walks Batman and the Riddler's coming at it from the other side. And it's, to me, the plot is very complex. As I said earlier, the Batman himself as a character is not complex. The Riddler, I do believe, is complex, but a villain can become perceived as being complex through the deviousness of his deeds. And this is very devious, and a lot of what he does in the film is very, very dark. He does his riddles that he leaves, or traps that he leaves, are very much like Saw. And as we were chatting beforehand, one of his things is, his joke is to leave a thumb drive with a thumb attached to it as a joke, but also too as a means for the people who find it to unlock the thumb drive and get the information he wants to give to them. And it's up to date with what we do in society today, whereas there's stuff going viral on the net. I mean, it's very in tune with everything we're doing.
Well, that's where I want to kind of wrap up the conversation about the Batman. Is one of the things that struck me right off the bat, but maybe that's the wrong way to say it, is the length of the movie. Long movie, I thought. I mean, it was well over 2 hours, and I don't
almost
know
3. It's just under 3. Yeah,
and that's quite. And that made me think. It's got sort of epic pretensions in a way. Like, it really is trying to fit in a lot of stuff about who we are and where we are and what's going on in the world. And there's a scene in the movie where there's a political candidate in a place that is called Gotham Square Garden, a little bit like Madison Square Garden in New York. And there's a flood. And I thought, well, here's the environmental component. We're sort of bringing in global warming and rising sea level. And I just thought, there's so much in this movie that it really is trying to cover so many different pockets. I thought, this is almost like an Odyssey or a Trojan War kind of thing, where it's just really all the pieces are in there. I was wondering what your reaction or response to just the length of the film all by itself is.
Yeah, I mean, also too, they try to hold a lot back for about an hour and a half. Like, you don't get any cool back gadgets. You don't see him fly. I mean, he's doing basically, Kung Fu, Taekwondo kind of moves. And then all of a sudden, when he meets up with the Catwoman, all these fancy, gimmicks break out that we know Batman for. I think they tried to put too much in. I think they could have come out of the gate a little bit quicker. I mean, I definitely think the film should have been more just over 2 hours instead of just under 3 hours. And I think they could have done more with balancing the character. Robert Pattinson's him and Zoe Kravitz are very, charismatic movie stars. But also, too, he looked like all the time, like no matter what. Even when he was as Bruce Wayne, the rich, like a heroin chic rock star. And I thought, I'm not certain that really is how Batman's supposed to be. Not that I have any preconception, but it just seemed that there was no bifurcation to his personality. There was just this very dour, I am vengeance. He just keeps saying that all the time.
It's interesting. It's funny you say that you don't have preconceptions. Of course, I do have preconceptions. My world was formed by these, half-hour TV programs. So that is my preconception. And it's very interesting for me, at least, to think about how they layer on all this complexity onto this character. The Batman. Go see it. Don't go see it. What's your recommendation?
If you've been a Batman aficionado, definitely go see it without a doubt. I think it's essential seeing for you. If you're curious, go. If you're kind of like, can I wait for a small screen or not? And that's really sort of where you're at. Wait for small screen.
Yeah. What else? So with the time we have left, and I just want to thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
What else are you looking at out there? What's interesting, and what's the stuff we should all be paying attention to?
Well, so this is the time of year where the Academy Awards are coming along. It's also the time of year they call the dumps. So they take films that aren't very good, they hold them back, and they dump them now because they thought they were going to be big releases. For example, coming out this week is Deep Water with Ben Affleck and Ana de Armas. She was in Knives Out and the latest James Bond. She's an up-and-coming talent. It's a twisted love story about a husband and a wife the wife has extramarital affairs in front of the husband's face. People Die. It's based on a Patricia Highsmith novel. And, you know, it's not a particularly good film, so Hulu is not going to, so it's not going to a movie theater. It'll be on Hulu this weekend for you. So there's a lot of movies like that, but there are a lot of little gems that come out around this time. For example, there's a great Russian film which opened last week called Compartment Number 6, which is about a Finnish woman in Moscow. She's an archaeology student. She needs to take a train 1,200 miles to a place where she can go look at these glyphs. She shares a sleeping car with this guy who's a drunken brute and sort of intimidating to her, says some nasty things to her, and it becomes sort of weirdly enough, a buddy film about her, because he's going to work in the same area, and they sort of become friends along the way, and in ways you would never expect a buddy film to work at. It's in a very subtle, slightly romantic way. It's also a slightly dark film. It's really, really a gripping drama. It feels very natural, and also feels like the actors are lived in those roles. So there are some gems, but right now, you know, mostly what is coming out is not great.
Yeah, well, Tom, it's been just great having you on. If people want to read your stuff, other reviews, other stuff you've written, where do they go?
CambridgeToday.com for the most part. You know, I also keep my own a log of the other things that I write, so they can go to. I have a website called forwhatitsworth.zone, FWIW.zone. So you know, you can go there too, or grab me on Substack.
What? If we were going to do another movie, what's the movie that we would do? What would you tell us to do?
You mean if we were going to do one that was city-based?
Yeah, well, it has to. So about cities and how it has to have some connection to cities. But as I said to you, King Kong fits in that. You know, there are lots of versions of that fit in that.
I mean, honestly, we were just talking about Soylent Green. I think it's a great film to talk about where we are in relevance today, because the concept behind it, it's based on a novel, is, and I forget the late 1700 economist came up with this theory that said, because we have civilization, population will grow exponentially, whereas our food sources will only grow linearly or in an arithmetic format. So therefore, there's this, you know, that's the concept of Soylent Green. We need to create a manufactured food source. So I think it would be a fantastic thing to look at. Also, too, as far as that striation of the rich and the poor, I mean, there really is only the poor, then there are the people who work for the rich, and then there are the rich, the hyper-rich, which pretty much run the corporations that run the municipalities. And similar to today, you know, there's one or two corporations that run everything. We have Apple, we have Amazon, we have Google. I mean, you know, a few years ago, those were probably, you know, General Motors and Exxon, et cetera, et cetera. Right. But there was more then, like the list was longer then, the list gets shorter and shorter. So it's interesting to look at sort of like how those, we're seeing the collapse now today, to look at how these dystopian, you know, it's not that far away. I mean, even though the date is now in Soylent Green, it just feels like that's closer to today than when they wrote the novel in 1966.
Right, no, which is, about my age. So that's a long time ago. We're going to close with a more somber note. Obviously, there's a war going on in Ukraine. You mentioned Russia. There's a character from Russia in one of the movies you mentioned. We are obviously thinking about the Ukrainian people and here on Unplanned, and our thoughts are with them as they struggle on for their freedom.
They could use Batman.
They could use Batman, for sure. Tom Meek,